June 14, 1945. Fort Hunt, Virginia. The air felt heavy, wet. A thick green smell of cut grass and damp earth, nothing like the sharp, dust-choked air of home. Annalise watched her own hands. They trembled slightly as they accepted the metal tray. The weight of it was wrong, too heavy. Her eyes registered the items one by one, as if cataloguing foreign artifacts. A piece of meat, dark and glistening, leaking juice onto a pile of white potatoes. A scoop of green peas, each one a perfect, tiny sphere, 2 slices of bread. The bread was the most alien thing. It was unnaturally white, soft-looking, a substance she no longer associated with sustenance, and beside it a perfect yellow square of butter, a solid fat. She carried the tray to a wooden table, her movements stiff, automatic. The scrape of the metal legs on the concrete floor was loud in the echoing hall. She sat. She did not eat. She simply stared at the plate. Memory surfaced, unbidden. Her mother, her face thin as paper, carefully slicing their weekly bread ration. The loaf was mostly sawdust. It crumbled into grey dust on the cutting board. Her mother's fingers meticulously gathering the crumbs, not a single one wasted. Here the bread sat untouched. The butter began to melt in the humid air, a slow golden tear tracing a path across the grey metal. Annalise felt a tightening in her chest, a pressure behind her eyes. It was not hunger. It was something else, something sharp and bewildering. A guard walked past, a man with a bland, unreadable face. He gestured with his chin toward her tray. His voice was flat without malice. Eat up. She could not. She raised a hand to her mouth, her fingers pressing against her lips, as if to hold back a sound or a sickness. The food steamed. The butter melted. And Annalise sat, frozen by an abundance more jarring than any bomb blast. Annalise was not alone in this paralysis. In the summer of 1945, she was one of several hundred German women held in facilities across the United States. They were a varied collection, captured in the final, chaotic collapse of the Third Reich. There were nurses from military hospitals, their hands still remembering the feel of flimsy paper bandages. There were secretaries and clerks from administrative headquarters in Berlin and Munich, women whose most dangerous weapon had been a typewriter. And there were the SS Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had served as guards, communications specialists, and administrative staff in the concentration camp system. They came from a world that had been systematically starved into submission. For years, their reality had been defined by the ration card. A flimsy piece of paper dictating their existence in grams and ounces. A few hundred grams of bread a day if they were lucky. A sliver of meat once a week. Potatoes when the supply lines hadn't been bombed. Turnips, cabbage, the endless watery cabbage soup. Their bodies had learned the language of scarcity. They knew the hollow ache of true hunger, the dull throb behind the eyes, the way cold seeped into your bones and stayed there. They knew the taste of ersatz. Ersatz coffee, brewed from roasted acorns and barley, a bitter, unsatisfying ghost of the real thing. Ersatz honey, a synthetic syrup that coated the tongue. Ersatz everything. They came from cities that were no longer cities, but sprawling cemeteries of rubble. They had learned to navigate by the skeletons of buildings they once knew, to sleep to the lullaby of air raid sirens, to smell approaching death in a shift of the wind. Their world had shrunk to the size of a basement shelter, to the weight of a near-empty ration book in a coat pocket. The immediate stakes were simple, brutal, and material. Find enough calories to survive another day. Secure your place in the queue. Guard your meager portion from the desperate. This was the world they carried inside them as they stepped off the transport ships and into the disorienting greenness of the American East Coast. The contrast began the moment they entered the system, and it was a relentless, percussive assault on their senses. It was a tale of two planets, told through the most mundane objects. In Germany, the bread was dark grey, dense, heavy with extenders like sawdust and potato flour. A slice had to be sawed from the loaf, and it tasted of soil and desperation. Here the bread was a substance from a dream. It was snow-white, lighter than air. It yielded without a fight. The women would poke it with their forks, watching it compress into a doughy wafer, baffled by its structure. A woman named Hannelore, who had worked in a bakery in Hamburg before the war, held a slice up to the light, her brow furrowed in disbelief. She couldn't understand how something so devoid of substance could even be called bread. It was a confection, a cloud. In Germany, fat was a currency more valuable than the Reichsmark. A woman might receive a ration of 50 grams of butter or margarine for an entire week, a tiny, precious smear she would portion out with surgical precision. Here, a yellow pat of butter sat on every tray for every meal. Some women in the first few days would hoard these squares, wrapping them in napkins and hiding them in their pockets, a reflex from a world where such a thing was treasure. They were confused when a fresh pat appeared at the next meal and the next. The supply, it seemed, was infinite. Then there was the coffee. For years, the scent of real coffee had been a ghost, a memory from before the war. They had forced down the bitter, chicory and acorn sludge that passed for a hot drink. In the American mess hall, the air was thick with the rich, unmistakable aroma of actual roasted coffee beans. For a woman named Ursula, a former signals operator from Dresden, the smell alone was enough to make her weep. She held the thick ceramic mug in both hands, letting the steam warm her face, and inhaled. It smelled like a world she thought had vanished forever. The numbers told a story their minds could barely grasp. A civilian in Berlin in the spring of 1945 was lucky to consume 1,200 calories a day. The official ration was often less. Here, in a prisoner of war camp, the diet was calculated to provide over 3,000 calories. It was a quantity of energy they had forgotten was possible. Their bodies, long accustomed to running on empty, didn't know how to react to this sudden, overwhelming flood of fuel. A woman named Greta, who had been a meticulous bookkeeper in a government office, found herself reverting to type. She sat with her tray, not eating but counting. She counted the peas. There were 87. She mentally divided the slice of meat into grams. At least 200, she estimated, more meat than she had seen in the last 6 months combined. She calculated the caloric density of the potatoes, the sugar in the coffee, the fat in the butter. Her mind, trained to manage scarcity, was now trying to quantify an impossible surplus. She kept a small, secret log on a piece of scavenged paper, marking down each meal. The numbers were a form of proof, a way to convince herself that what she was experiencing was real. Her internal monologue was a dry, analytical ledger of disbelief. Tuesday, eggs for breakfast, real eggs, 2 of them. Wednesday, beef stew for lunch. I could see the chunks of carrot. Thursday, chocolate pudding for dessert. It was an incantation against the unreality of it all. Another prisoner, Ilse, had been a nurse. Her perspective was clinical. She looked at the trays not as meals, but as prescriptions. She saw protein for rebuilding muscle, vitamins for fighting off disease, fats for energy and warmth. She watched the other women. She saw the sallowness of their skin begin to fade after a week. She saw the dullness in their hair recede, replaced by a subtle sheen. She noticed the tremors in their hands lessening. The American food was medicine. It was methodically healing the years of state-enforced malnutrition. She felt her own body responding, a sense of warmth spreading through her limbs after a meal, a feeling she hadn't registered in years. The dull ache in her joints began to subside. One evening, she pressed her fingers into the flesh of her own arm. It felt different, firmer. There was a substance there that hadn't existed a month ago. She found herself observing the American guards, the female administrators of the camp. They moved with a casual energy, an economy of motion that spoke of well-fed bodies. They were not thin, not fat. They were just solid. They inhabited their bodies with an unconscious confidence that Ilse found both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It was the physical manifestation of a nation that had never, not for a single day, had to wonder where its next meal was coming from. The women saw the results, but they could not initially comprehend the cause. They were the recipients of a system so vast, so efficient, it was practically invisible. The food did not appear by magic. It was the end product of a colossal machine, an architecture of abundance that spanned a continent. It began in the sprawling, untouched fields of the American Midwest, where farms were not battlefields but engines of production. It flowed through a network of railways and processing plants, a logistical miracle managed by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. This was the entity, a concept more than a group of people, responsible for feeding, clothing, and equipping an army of millions scattered across the globe. For the women in the camp, this system was experienced only at its final point of delivery, the mess hall line. They saw the seamless transition from one meal to the next. The supply never faltered. The breakfast eggs were replaced by lunch's stew, the stew by dinner's roast chicken, with a clockwork predictability that defied their entire experience of the world. In Germany, life had been a constant struggle against entropy, a battle with broken supply lines, corrupt officials, and the simple, brute fact of scarcity. Here there was an order, a rhythm, a relentless, unthinking efficiency. A woman might notice a truck, arriving at the camp kitchen in the morning. She'd see men in uniform unloading crates, but she could not truly grasp the scale of the operation that sent it. The schematic metaphor that formed in their collective understanding was that of a great, silent river, a river of food, of supplies, of material wealth, flowing from an inexhaustible source. They were standing at its mouth, watching it empty into their camp, and they could not even imagine its origins. It was a power that did not need to shout, a dominance expressed not through speeches or parades, but through the quiet, undeniable fact of a full plate of food delivered 3 times a day. This silent, overwhelming competence was, in its own way, more intimidating than the tanks and planes that had destroyed their cities. It was the machinery of a victor, operating calmly, a world away from the fight. The assault of abundance was not limited to the mess hall. It extended to every facet of their new, imprisoned lives, creating a series of secondary contrasts that were just as jarring. The very clothes on their backs told the story. When they arrived, many were wearing the last of their worn, threadbare civilian clothes, or uniforms made of the infamous German *ersatz materials. Rayon that disintegrated in the rain, cloth woven from wood pulp that felt harsh against the skin. Their shoes were often a patchwork of leather and cardboard. Within days, they were issued new clothing, simple, shapeless work garments and uniforms made of thick, sturdy American cotton. Hannelore the baker ran her hands over the fabric of her new shirt. The weave was tight, the stitching perfect. It was a humble, functional garment, yet it possessed a material integrity that felt like an incredible luxury. She thought of her sister's wedding dress, patched together from an old parachute. These prison clothes were of a higher quality. Even the soap was a revelation. In Germany, soap had been a gritty grey block made from rendered animal fat and sand, a substance that scoured the skin raw and left a foul smell. In the camp washroom, they were given bars of ivory soap. It was smooth white, and it smelled faintly of perfume. It produced a thick, creamy lather that felt impossibly gentle. Most astonishingly, it floated. The women would watch it bob on the surface of the water in the sinks, a small, inexplicable miracle. The shelters themselves provided another point of contrast. They came from a world of damp, crowded cellars and the skeletal remains of apartment buildings, where a roof that didn't leak was a blessing. The American camps were an exercise in orderly construction. The barracks were simple wooden structures, but they were clean, dry, and weatherproof. The windows had glass. The roofs were sound. There were cots with mattresses and wool blankets for every prisoner. At night, a woman named Margaret lay on her cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Virginia countryside, the chirping of insects, the rustle of wind in the trees. It was a deep, profound quiet, utterly unlike the nights in Munich, which had been punctuated by sirens, anti-aircraft fire, and the distant, rumbling thunder of collapsing buildings. The quiet here felt as abundant as the food. It was a surplus of peace, and it was almost as difficult to absorb. One data point, overheard from a camp administrator, stuck in their minds. The camp's water heaters were rated to provide enough hot water for every prisoner to have a 5-minute shower every single day. Hot water on demand. The idea was so foreign, so deeply luxurious, it bordered on the absurd. This constant, multisensory evidence of American wealth and efficiency created a deep friction, an ideological clash that played out in the minds of the women. They were, after all, products of one of the most powerful propaganda machines in human history. For more than a decade, they had been told a consistent story. America was a decadent mongrel nation, a chaotic society weakened by capitalism and racial impurity. It was inefficient, disorganized, and lacked the spiritual and material discipline of the German Reich. The German soldier, the German worker, the German mother, these were the archetypes of strength and sacrifice. The American was portrayed as soft, lazy, and materialistic. Yet the reality they now inhabited directly contradicted every one of those tenets. How could a decadent and inefficient nation produce such an endless, overwhelming river of food, clothing, and material? Where was the chaos? They saw only order. Where was the weakness? They saw only a quiet, confident strength that manifested in the quality of the bread and the reliability of the hot water. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. Their entire worldview, the framework they had used to understand their place in the world, was being systematically dismantled, not by interrogation or re-education, but by the mundane reality of their daily lives. The competence was the thing that truly unnerved them. They could have perhaps understood brute force, But this was different. This was competence on a scale that felt almost planetary. A role inversion began to take shape in their perceptions. They who had been told they were the master race, the pinnacle of organization, were now the helpless recipients of a system whose workings they could not even begin to fathom. Meanwhile, their captors, the degenerate Americans, were the masters of a logistical and productive empire that had crushed the Reich without, it seemed, even breaking a sweat. Was it possible that the entire foundation of their belief system was a lie? The question was too terrifying for many to confront directly. So it lingered, unspoken, in the quiet moments, while stirring sugar into real coffee, while lacing up sturdy boots, while feeling the impossible softness of a white bread sandwich. It was a silent, gnawing doubt, planted by the very comfort of their captivity. The evidence for this systemic superiority was not just anecdotal. It was embedded in the very logistics of their confinement, a reality they began to piece together from observation and overheard conversations. They learned that the food they were eating was not special prison fare. It was, with minor adjustments, the standard issue ration for an American GI. They were being fed according to the same meticulous nutritional standards designed to keep a soldier in fighting shape. This fact filtered through the camp grapevine, landed with the force of a bomb. Their enemy fed its prisoners the same quality of food it fed its own warriors. It could afford to. Greta, the bookkeeper, made a mental note of this. It was a data point that spoke volumes about national priorities and, more importantly, national capacity. Records from the period confirm this reality with stark, unambiguous numbers. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 96 million metric tons of steel, more than double the output of Germany and Japan combined. It built nearly 100,000 aircraft. American farmers, even with millions of men overseas, harvested record-breaking crops of corn, wheat, and soybeans. This industrial and agricultural avalanche was what the women were experiencing on a micro level. They were living inside a rounding era of America's productive surplus. The women also observed the mail system. Letters from home, when they finally arrived, were skeletal things. They were written on flimsy, low-quality paper, the ink faded, the words cramped to save space. They spoke of hunger, of cold, of a desperate search for missing family members. By contrast, the prisoners were given access to the V-mail system. They could write letters that would be microfilmed, flown across the Atlantic, and reprinted in the United States for delivery to their families in occupied Germany. The sheer technological sophistication of this process was baffling to them. That a nation in the midst of a global war had the resources and organizational will to create such a system for prisoner mail seemed to defy all logic. It was another small, quiet indicator of a power that operated on a different plane of reality. They saw it too in the medical care. When a woman fell ill, she was taken to an infirmary that was clean, well-stocked with medicine, and staffed by trained personnel. Ilse, the nurse, was stunned by the profligate use of sterile bandages, of sulfur drugs, of aspirin. These were items that had been rationed with the jealousy of state secrets in the hospitals where she had worked. Here they were dispensed freely. The evidence pack was not a document they read, but a reality they inhabited. Each meal, each clean shirt, each letter sent, each aspirin tablet, was a piece of data confirming a truth their ideology had violently denied. The cumulative weight of this evidence, this relentless, quiet confrontation with a superior system, began to exact a psychological and emotional cost. The initial shock and bewilderment slowly curdled into something more complex, more painful. For some, it was a profound and crushing sense of shame. They felt it most acutely when letters from home arrived. A woman would sit on her cot, holding a piece of paper that smelled of Germany, of smoke and damp wool. Her mother's spidery handwriting would describe the daily hunt for food, the watery soup, the gnawing hunger of the younger children. The woman would read these words, her own stomach full of beef and potatoes, and a chasm of guilt would open beneath her. She was a prisoner, an enemy of the state that held her, and yet she was living a life of material ease that was now an impossible fantasy for her own family. The food, once a source of wonder, became a source of torment. Every bite was an act of betrayal. A few women began to refuse food, or to eat only the bare minimum required to avoid the infirmary. It was a small, desperate act of solidarity with the starving millions back home. For others, the emotion was a slow-burning anger, an anger directed not at their captors, but at their own leaders. Hitler, Goebbels, Goering, they had promised a 1,000-year Reich, a world dominated by German strength and efficiency. They had demanded total sacrifice from the German people in pursuit of this vision, and it had all been a catastrophic lie. They had led their nation into a war against an enemy whose true power they had fatally misunderstood. The sight of a fully stocked pantry in the camp kitchen could trigger a flash of rage in a woman who had seen her neighbor's children die of malnutrition. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a comprehensive, systemic humiliation. The emotional crescendo often happened in the quiet of the barracks at night. The lights would be out, the other women would be asleep, and a woman would lie awake, her body warm under a wool blanket, her stomach full, and the full weight of her new reality would crash down upon her. It was a silent, internal collapse, a quiet whisper in the dark, a choked sob quickly stifled in a pillow. It was the physical processing of a shattered worldview. The body, finally safe and nourished, was beginning to allow the mind to feel the true depth of the catastrophe. It was the devastating piece of total defeat. And in that quiet, nourished darkness, a new understanding began to take root. It was a turn, a revelation that reinterpreted everything they had seen. The food, the soap, the sturdy clothes, they were not just random acts of kindness or the byproducts of a wealthy nation. They were weapons. The real, decisive weapon of the war had not been the V-2 rocket or the Tiger tank. It was the American factory, the American farm, and the logistical genius that connected them. The women began to see that the war had been won not on the battlefields of Normandy or Stalingrad, but in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of California, and the wheat fields of Kansas. This was the central, terrifying truth that had been hidden from them. They had been participants in a conflict that was, from the beginning, an industrial mismatch of historic proportions. Germany's war machine, for all its vaunted efficiency and technological prowess, was a brittle, resource-starved enterprise compared to the American behemoth. Their leaders had mistaken tactical brilliance for strategic depth and ideological fervor for sustainable power. The revelation crystallized into a single devastating sentence that echoed in the prisoners' minds. America did not win because it fought better. It won because it could produce more. This insight reframed their entire experience. The camp was not just a prison, it was a demonstration, a quiet, unstated exhibition of the very power that had crushed them. The calm, well-fed guards were not merely jailers, they were representatives of a system that could afford to be humane because its victory was so absolute, so comprehensive, that cruelty had become unnecessary. This was not the end of a war, it was the result of an audit, and their nation had been found bankrupt. The implications were staggering. It meant that all their sacrifices, the years of hunger, the loss of their homes and families, had been spent in service of a fundamentally flawed and doomed project. Their belief had been invested in an enterprise that was destined to fail from the moment it challenged the productive might of the United States. This re-evaluation of the past connected their own human-scale experiences to the vast, impersonal machinery of history. The feeling of a full stomach after years of hunger was no longer just a personal, physiological event. It became a symbol. It was the feeling of a system that worked, a system that generated surplus instead of scarcity. The cause and effect ladder was brutally simple. A nation with secure, continent-spanning agriculture and industry tends to produce a food surplus. A nation with a food surplus can field a well-fed army and still have enough left over to feed its prisoners according to international law. A nation that can do this possesses a deep, structural power that is more resilient than any army built on ideology alone. The women's personal cognitive dissonance, the gap between what they had been told and what they were now seeing, was a microcosm of Germany's catastrophic strategic miscalculation. They had been taught to value hardness, sacrifice, and ideological purity. But here, they were confronted with the evidence that comfort, abundance, and a certain kind of pragmatic, boring efficiency were the true foundations of global power. The motifs of their new life became analytical tools. The hands of a camp administrator, signing a supply requisition with a smooth, well-made pen, represented a bureaucracy that functioned. The smell of real coffee brewing was the smell of global trade routes that had never been broken. The quiet at night was the sound of a homeland untouched by bombs, a peace that allowed for uninterrupted production and planning. This synthesis did not happen overnight. It was a slow, painful process of intellectual and emotional digestion taking place over months. It was the dawning realization that the most important battles are often fought and won years before the first shot is fired, in the factories, fields, and shipping lanes that are the true terrain of modern warfare. Their captivity was a lesson in the material basis of power, a lesson they were learning one meal, one hot shower, one good night's sleep at a time. We returned to analyze at the table on that first day. The image of her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the tray of food. We understand now what is happening behind her eyes. It is not just the shock of seeing so much food. It is the first tremor of a collapsing world. The sight of a simple meal has presented her with a contradiction so profound it has frozen her in place. On that plate is the undeniable, edible proof that everything she has been taught, everything she has suffered for, was built on a lie. Her entire reality is being unwritten by a piece of white bread and a melting square of butter. This quiet, personal moment of crisis is where the real history happens, not in the grand speeches of leaders, but in the minds of ordinary people, when the foundational myths of their society are proven false by direct, sensory evidence. What happens to a person or a nation when the core of their belief system is so thoroughly and quietly dismantled? If this story unsettles your assumptions about how power works, that is the point. Notice what changes when victory is measured not in territory captured, but in calories delivered. What we choose to see as strength defines the world we build. To explore another story of how unseen systems shape our lives, subscribe for our next episode. Tell us in the comments, what is the most powerful weapon that is not a weapon at all?